Welcome to the Learning to Die podcast.
I'm Ian Dunican.
And I'm Kieran O'Regan.
How do I live when I know I must die?
We explore areas of philosophy, psychology, martial arts, culture, existential risk, history, society, religion, science, and anything else that seems of interest and relevance to answering that question.
We can only hope that some of what we learn might be of benefit to you too. Namaste, sapiens. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We're all scattered across the five corners of the earth. Today I am joined by Dr. Neil Durrant. Neil, thank you very much for coming on.
Thanks, Ian. It's very good to be here.
So we were just talking before we started. Today we're going to have our conversation. It's going to be focused on this awesome book, which I'll put in the show notes, Nietzsche's Renewal of Ancient Ethics, which I was just telling Neil that I picked up on Good Friday. And I read then cover to cover until the next Wednesday, made copious amounts of notes and defaced his book by making notes in the margins and underlying passages as well. It was one of those books that got me fired up. So it's absolutely brilliant. So it's great to have you on to talk about this, Neil. So Neil, you're based in Sydney, but you have a very interesting background. And without going into it too much, from what I've read and heard on another podcast recently, you basically started out as an Anglican priest. If that word is correct. You picked up a Nietzsche book and then started questioning what you were doing. And then sort of fast forward 20 years, you did a PhD focused on Nietzsche. You wrote a book and now you're talking to us two idiots. Would that be about right?
Yeah. For a high level summary, that's pretty good. Thanks, Ian. Yes, it was a long journey out of Christianity, but I grew up in a Christian household and from a young age was determined to become a minister in the church and sort of charted my life path around that goal. I'm studying various degrees along the way, but yes, when I was an Anglican priest, when I was training for the ministry at a very conservative Bible college, was about the time I was up to reading Nietzsche, and Nietzsche was challenging to read as a Christian person, but I just sort of kept going, hoping one day it would all come together, and in the end, had sort of abandoned my faith and had a really sudden career change.
But Neil, I when I read the book and I was and this is probably Kieran and I both come from Catholic backgrounds in Ireland, and I'm a little bit older than Kieran, so I was a bit more, I suppose, a bit more stringent in the 80s and 90s Catholic Ireland, and to give people a kind of an idea, like you couldn't get divorced, abortion wasn't legal, you couldn't buy condoms, like it was, and then
couldn't be gay until 1994.
Say again?
Couldn't be gay until 1994.
Yeah, you could. Yeah, that was
illegal. Totally it was illegal. Yeah,
totally out of question. And then, and even like in the mid to late 90s, if you went in and bought condoms, some chemists or pharmacists wouldn't even sell them to you. You get run out the door, you'd be terrified, right? Yeah, sure. So it was like you were buying drugs. So it's quite an interesting area. But over the last couple of years, I've been actually quite attracted to the Anglican faith, or because it seems to be a bit more balanced. It seems to be a bit more inclusive. So. Can I ask why you abandoned that faith and not try to integrate Nietzsche? Was it too much of a juxtaposition? Because the Anglican faith seems to me like it's a bit more inclusive of lots of ideas and lots of people.
Yeah, I guess I've got two answers to that. One is that the version of Anglicanism that I was a part of, Sydney Anglicanism, is very conservative. It's sort of up to conservative. The Bible is literally true. There's no errors in it. It's sort of that. So very. I do know what you mean about sort of middle Anglicanism, if you like. It is a much sort of softer landing place for people that have intellectual kind of questions, but that wasn't the part of the church that I was in. That's one part of the answer. The other answer would be the kinds of intellectual problems that I ended up having with Christianity kind of, to my mind, really go to the heart of all versions of Christianity, which is to do with the doctrine of God. It's to do with God as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, the metaphysics of that, the ethics that comes from that. And I just, that was what I really focused on in Bible college, went deep into the doctrine of God through people like T.F. Torrance, who was an academic at the University of Edinburgh, who kind of rediscovered, in a lot of ways, ancient thinking around that. And So in the end, I just thought this ethics of self-sacrificing love, which is really grounded in the very core of the doctrine of God, which is sort of the definition of being a Christian as opposed to a Jew, as opposed to a Muslim. There's three persons, one God. I just thought this isn't working for me. I just can't make sense of it. And I mean, Nietzsche was a big part of that.
Yeah.
Because he provided an alternative to that. But I don't think I would have stuck with Christianity in any case.
Do you think, Neil, given your work over the last sort of 15, 20 years and your reflections, is there still a place for Christianity in today's modern world?
Yeah, I mean, this is going to sound a little bit harsh, and I don't actually mean it that way, but for me, there are many, many, many useful errors. I mean, the idea that we're going to find the truth and that the truth is going to somehow be good for us, both of those two ideas I have a problem with. And I have that problem from a Nietzsche. Nietzsche kind of gave me that problem. One, could we ever find a truth if it was out there? And secondly, if we found it, maybe it would be really bad for us. So we sort of anthropomorphize the universe, and this idea that discovering the truth will somehow be good for human beings might actually be false. So in fact, what we're kind of working with a lot of the time is helpful or useful delusions. And maybe Christianity is that for some people, a helpful delusion. I don't think it can ever be more than that. But I think the same of every religion and almost every philosophy. These are it's the error that helps you get to the next step in your life. That's the one that you should stick with, and maybe Christianity is that for some people.
Neil, you spoke there about sort of your study of Christianity, and in the book at the start, you really kind of unpack what's called agape love, AGAPE. Could you just describe, in your own words for people listening, what exactly is agape love?
Sure. Do you want me to go into the Trinitarian stuff as part of that? Because that freaks a lot of people out. But I can write to the source if you like.
You can freak us out. We don't mind.
Yeah. So agape love is the Greek term agape, which is took a central place in Christian ethics from, I would say, from the Pauline letters onwards, which is this idea of other person-centered love. That when you love, you focus on the needs, the values, the wants of the other person, and you make sacrifices. You sacrifice yourself as needed in order to benefit other people. Now, in Christianity, the greatest example of that, of course, is Jesus Christ giving his life for undeserving sinners in order to redeem them. It's a sacrifice that's completely sort of off the scale. It's God himself dying on the cross for unworthy, undeserving, deeply sinful people. And so this is the model of sacrifice, the model of love. That's what love is to give yourself for others. So, and that has a deep root in Christianity, in my view, which is that the God himself, and it is a him in Christianity, I'm sorry, God himself.
That's okay. We won't cancel you. It's okay.
Okay.
Unlike that, but you might get cancelled. But you might get cancelled in the Anglican Church at the moment, because apparently they're doing debates over whether God is gender neutral now over in England.
Yeah, it's a very apropos debate, I suppose. and look, I'm very supportive of that thinking. But if I'm going to describe how traditional Christianity is thought about, the pronouns.
And it makes more sense, just archetypally, it makes more sense because of the conceptual nature of it, and it's just you can
So the idea is that three persons, one being. So Christianity wrestled with this in the first 300-400 years. How do we make sense of this philosophically? And they came up with this idea of a relational ontology where the being of the Father is in the Son, and the being of the Son is in the Father. So it's de-centered personhood. You don't have a personhood in yourself. You have a personhood in the other being. And the Holy Spirit is the mediator of this, and the Holy Spirit is love. And so what that means is that the very ground of all reality, the being of God himself, is de-centered, other person-centered love. And so that means, for human beings to be made in the image of God, which is the core Christian concept, we then also we are most ourselves when we express our lives in other person-centered, giving, self-sacrificing love. The way to be human is to sacrifice yourself for others, because your being is actually in them, not in you, on the model of God himself. So this is the concept of other person-centered love, agape love. Self-sacrificing yourself for others is the highest moral good or attainment for a human being.
So this is an interesting one, because last year I read a book, and Kieran recommended it to me, was Love Thy Enemy by Martin Luther King Jr. And he speaks about agape love and that. And it seems very like, oh, this is the way to go. Love everybody. This is great. You know, this is the way to go. But when I read your book, Neil, I was like, fuck agape love. That's what I thought. At the end of it, I was like, this man's onto it, because what I did was reverse my thinking. It's all about living your life for other people. Nearly. And I thought, well, one, that can be weaponized and utilized, and people can use that then to their advantage to coerce people into the good for the collective, nearly. And me and Karen have been speaking about this tension between the individual and the collective. So that can be used against people, I think. So this kind of agape love, I think, can be weaponized. So I've brought up a lot of personal examples from me, you know, about, and particularly in Ireland, this was used when we were kids. Just be quiet, just be good, just be, like, it was never about expressing yourself. It was just about, just do what's right for other people and never think of yourself. Whereas in Buddhism, it's the opposite. Buddhism often says, like, you know, you work on yourself. Don't worry about other people. A bit like Stoicism to a degree. Work on yourself. Don't worry about what anyone else is doing. You become that beacon of shining light. You know, this kind of lighthouse in a sea of shit, really. And then you can inspire other people. And so that's what I got when I read your book about agape love. And I think agape love now, in retrospect so far, and I'm always open to changing my mind, I actually said, and my question for you today was, do you think, based upon what I've just said there, is agape love just weakness? Is it just a weak form? Is it a way of tapping out and going, well, I'm just loving everybody. So if I just do that, I'm just, you know, because this sacrifice for others, I just view it now as being weak.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's true. I think it is a kind of it's the sort of road of least resistance in a way, to just kind of say, well, it's all about other people, when a lot of what we struggle with is actually ourselves. I think that's true. I mean, this thing about it being weaponized, I mean, I see the call to self-sacrificial love as a power play. Who stands to gain? Yeah. If I was to say to somebody else, you know, you need to be loving towards me, therefore you need to sacrifice yourself for me, that's just a really weird power play, because wouldn't they turn around to me and say, but you should sacrifice yourself for me? And
we all sacrifice.
Yeah. So, and in the end, I mean, Nietzsche's stance on this, I think, is really helpful, which is that, I mean, not only is it weak, but it leads to weakness, because you actually need to have something to give. And so if you're constantly emptying yourself for others on the model of Jesus Christ, then you will end up in practical terms also being useless to the people around you, which is sort of self-defeating in a way.
Do you think, Neil, we've seen a little, without getting too political, do you think we've seen a little bit of this in the last few years with some leaders, particularly on the left, the Jacinta Ardern's in New Zealand, Justin Trudeau's in Canada, where they kind of gone, I'm just trying to do this to love everybody and be kind, but really it's anything but that. Do you think we've seen that kind of evolve into a kind of a secular way, this agape love?
Yeah, I mean, I think that about love. I think that about compassion as well. I mean, these can become power plays. It's a sort of this call for people to behave in a moral way, and so you're calling on their conscience, but what you're doing is extracting benefit for your own agenda by calling on that sort of giving people a bad conscience if they do what's best for them. And I think that's a massive problem.
Yeah. Okay, and can I, if I was to steal men, and not steal men, but to propose something that I think might be going on with, I never actually talked to Ian about this yet, but it's something I've been wrestling with for a while. And because I'm very interested in evolutionary psychology as well, and looking at and what information is available and has been made, that I've been able to come across on like small scale societies, you know, like 50, 100 people, Dunbar's number, this kind of stuff. And something that I think Christianity in particular taps into, this is independent of any of the large kind of metaphysical claims or the deification or not of Christ, of Jesus, etc., is that when you look at what the requirements of small scale tribal societies, what we would have came from up to 10,000 years ago, agriculture, etc., maybe a bit longer or whatever, but regardless, small scale societies, a major component of the survival of the tribe is reciprocal altruism, and people being able to, I go hunting today and I'm successful and you're not, I'm going to come back and I'm going to share with you, because then when I'm not successful, you will be. But also, if you just look at it from purely a selfishness perspective, then that kind of altruism is useful to a certain extent. But then there's an evolutionary advantage if it also feels good for me to share with people that I like as well. So then there's actually an evolutionary advantage to self-sacrifice built in from a sharing perspective that would have facilitated small group survival during times of difficulty, famine, struggle, etc. And if you look at, you chart that across, and you can see that shit even in other primate species, other great primates share from a very young age. They'll share food, etc. Even babies will share food. You know, they'll even young human babies will share food. And so when you look, so there's that kind of component as part of it. And then just, I don't think where I kind of like differ from, I suppose, from my understanding of Nietzsche, is I don't think our morality is like formed just from kind of like our exposures and kind of, you know, it's more that we have an evolutionary selection pressure that formed our foundational basic out the womb, here we go, there's some wiring there. And I think a lot of what the this kind of Christian self-sacrifice taps into is a very real component of human biology, which is that it exploits. It's almost like an evolutionary Christianity almost. It cuts to this component, but then where it obviously goes awry is when, part of what then accelerates that is, from a Nietzschean perspective, you could take this argument, is that Christianity then takes, and obviously rooting it back to, you know, his original, I suppose, framing of slave morality, where you could kind of like, for any of the listeners, it's basically the Jews are living underneath the Egyptians, and it's, again, from an evolutionary perspective, to bring evolution into it, it would have been evolutionarily useful for them to develop a moral system that made them feel special because they were victims. Because anyone who was going to stick their head above the parapet was going to get it removed by the Egyptians. So it became evolutionarily useful to develop this, again, just from a cultural evolution, like mimetic perspective. And then you chart that through. And when you look at that, the Christ character then embodies a story, this agape self-sacrifice on behalf of the other. But then as a moral framework, essentially took the human warrior spirit and other kind of more vitalistic kind of forces around, and obviously when things got more and more repressive sexually, etc., and it pointed it inwards in an ascetic manner. So then it became, when you took all those things together, okay, I'm special if I'm oppressed, this kind of low resolution slave morality description, plus by turning my in this very, again, low resolution way of looking at love your enemy, and I turn my warrior spirit and my sexual vitalism inward on top of myself in an ascetic direction. But I'm doing it for the benefit of others. It's actually exploiting an evolutionary mechanism that was there from way before civilization, that's in other primates that we separated from 6 million years ago as well. So I think this is obviously something that Nietzsche couldn't have known about, because Darwin was his book was only a few decades old when Nietzsche died, whatever, 3 or 4 decades old. And there wasn't evolutionary psychology and everything. But on that kind of framing, I'm gonna have to find a load of information. It's not so much as a question as a proposition. How would you think about that kind of structure or framework?
No, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, Nietzsche does, I think he does. I don't think he read Darwin, but he had read Herbert Spencer. So he had the site. I mean, evolutionary biology was a revelation to him because it gave him a materialist, non-metaphysical way out of some of these proposals proposals that religion had sort of put on people. So, and I think you can take that evolutionary psychology. He does talk about that sort of thing, that over time, over decades, we breed for certain kinds of outcomes, and perhaps altruism is one of them. So that is there in his thinking, particularly in the science. But I think you can actually, what I try to do sometimes is, in thinking about this, is take that evolutionary perspective over long generational time. I actually think you can apply it within an individual lifespan. So, for example, when people talk about self-sacrifice as a virtue, I think about it as, well, generally speaking, I think there is a mechanism where people will make sacrifices because they understand that in the end, that will be to their own benefit. So, for example, I mean, the one I like to talk about, and people don't like this, but is the great examples of self-sacrifice, motherhood, or a doctor or a nurse or a soldier on the front line giving their life for others. And this is this noble act of self-sacrifice for a common good. Well, I kind of say, well, is it? I mean, often what's happening is this person has a picture in their mind of who they want to be. And this person they want to be, I want to be the mother that gives everything for my children. And so in giving everything for my children, I get this real sense of worth and satisfaction and joy and pleasure at being the person that I want to be. And so actually it's very self-serving. You're serving your own psychological need, making yourself feel good, making yourself feel well-grounded through these acts of sacrifice, because you've set this ideal up in your mind. So I think in the end, we really are very self-serving. It's the same as people that look at Nietzsche and go, he's very individualistic, every person out for themselves, fuck everybody else, just do what works for you. And I say, well, I don't really think that's what Nietzsche's saying. But even if he was, I mean, the reality is, when I invest in my relationships with other people, and I invest deeply in my relationships with other people, and I care about them and what works for them, one of the realities behind that is that is going to produce something good in my life. That is going to produce something that I value. It's going to give me the friend that I want to have. And so in the end, it's a virtuous circle, whereby by investing in others, you actually give yourself one of the main things that you need in order to do well in life, which is a close circle of friends. So self-centeredness, selfishness is not, in fact, the opposite of other concern. In fact, those two things are deeply connected. If you want to invest in yourself, one of the things you will do very naturally is invest in others.
Yeah, I call that, I was looking at that from this kind of thing from a sports, long story short, it's got to do with how people can navigate struggle most kind of effectively. So I went across a load of different domains. I was doing some research on it a few years ago, some PhD research, and I came up with this concept called altruistic heroism.
Yeah, right.
So not altruistic, because it's somewhere between extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. But it's a kind of the framing of the kind of heroic participation in existence, orientated toward feeling as if I can be of benefit to something greater than I am, bigger, toward other people, toward some larger purpose or some larger mission. But because that's what feels awesome to do. So it's intrinsically really rewarding, but it's altruistically focused toward an expectation of having an extrinsic impact for the better in participating in this heroic like sport. Or I was using examples from warfare. I drew a lot of examples because I was drawing a lot of examples from like military testimony from combatants, and way that they would talk about fighting to the death and being in gunfights and jumping on grenades, and fellas who survived from jumping on grenades and happened to live through because of freak. The body armor happened to be in the right place or whatever, or the grenade didn't go off, or these kind of stories. But so it's like the interesting component is from a morality perspective is with Nietzsche is, so I suppose with Nietzsche, this is just, I suppose I'll go to this question because it's something I wanted to ask you about, but How would you? So I'll go to the master morality part first, because I think this then frames it really well on how to think about, I suppose, Nietzschean morality. So there's two quotes that I have here, one from the Antichrist and one from Genealogy of Morals. Mm-hmm. And I read the Antichrist first, because I think it's like really poetic distillation. He said, "What is good? Everything that heightens the feeling of power in man, the will to power, power itself. What is bad? Everything that is born of weakness. What is happiness? The feeling that power is growing, that resistance is overcome, not contentedness, but more power, not peace, but war, not virtue, but fitness. The weak and the failures shall perish. First principles of our love of man, and they shall be given every possible assistance. What is more harmful than any vice? Active pity for all the failures and all the weak. Christianity." And now the Genealogy of Morals. He said, so this is in relation. He says, these blonde beasts, which I believe more relates to the lion than it does a specific blonde lad from Germany. It relates to the sentiment of the predatory blonde beast. And he goes, the blonde beasts that are better than, not much better than beasts of prey that have been loosed. So then he said, there they enjoy freedom from any social control. In the wilderness, they who so long chafed under the strictures imposed by society to ensure tranquility and order are released from them. They revert to the innocent, primal state of the beast of prey, like jubilant monsters without a conscience who saunter away with bravado and equanimity after a rampage of murder, arson, rape, and torture, as though they had merely played some wild student's prank, perfectly convinced that the poets will now have something to sing about and celebrate for long after. It is impossible not to recognize at the core of all these aristocratic races the beast of prey, the magnificent marauding blonde beast, lusting after victory and spoils. It needs to be released from time to time. The beast must be loosed again and return into the wilderness. The Roman, Arabic, German, and Japanese nobility, the Homeric heroes, the Scandinavian Vikings are all alike in this need. So those two quotes, I think, really well capture this, the distillation. So just for any of the listeners who've never read any Nietzsche, Nietzsche, from anyway, he lived his life anyway, wasn't a violent man. So put that, he wasn't and he was a very poetic writer and everything, but that's just the frame at that. He wasn't actually suggesting people go out and do rape and torture literally. But how do you, given those, so when you've heard those descriptions, I'm sure you've read those over and over again in your writings and research. How do you take, or do those, first of all, do those represent, even in a poetic, distilled way, what he's getting to as his kind of master morality, as this alternative to Christian slave morality, or are they just are they something else, or am I off the mark?
Yeah, no, I mean, they're wonderful pieces of writing, and certainly for me, The Antichrist and Twilight of the Idols were very significant books in changing my mind about Christianity. I think there's a boring kind of academic thing we have to take into consideration here, which is Nietzsche's development over time. So if you look at his earlier books, pre-Genealogy of Morals, he has a much more sort of temperate kind of way of writing about these things. And there's something that happens for him, I think, as he develops as a philosopher into his later writings, which leads to some of this more extreme kind of writing style. And I think, lots of people interpret that in different ways. And I think we need to read it all together. So if you look at his earlier stuff on things like strength and weakness and Christianity and the customary morality, the sort of constraints of society, what he was talking about there in that passage, I think a lot of this arises from his interest in ancient Greek Homeric literature. He was an academic philologist, so he was translating, the ancient works. And I think what he saw in ancient Greece, in that heroic ethos, which came out in the Vikings and that whole description, is he sees a kind of innocence, a free conscience for people to be as they are. And he doesn't think that people are sinful the way Christianity thinks they're sinful. There's this fear, I think, that Christianity has given us that if we just allow people to be as they are, everything's going to go to hell in a handbasket. Whereas Nietzsche, I think, has a much more actual temperate view of that the beast will come out from time to time. There will be these contests. There will be this arm wrestles. And I think he thinks about that more around intellectual contests, like the grand heroic effort to discover what works, what doesn't work, how people can flourish, what diminishes humankind, what strengthens humankind, both individually and collectively. So, I mean, in Daybreak, there's a passage where he's very clear that all of that blood sport kind of imagery, he's talking about the internal contest that a person goes through and the contest they go through in engagement with another person. So I think if you read all of that together, I think what he's saying is something along the lines of, let's not be constrained in what we think and how we act. Instead, let's engage in really open, sort of open-minded, open-ended contest with one another. That we'll only discover what's excellent if we allow ourselves to fully immerse ourselves in the contest that's in front of us. And then in the sort of ancient Greek framework, both the winner and the loser stand to win, because what that contest will reveal, the sort of warrior spirit of engagement, is the next contingent standard of excellence. It'll be like, so if I lose to someone who's really genuinely defeated me, I can sit back and say, oh, that's amazing. I wish I could do what you had done. Let me learn how to do that. And so people that learn how to do that, and becomes a...
the agon was the Greek phrase, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So I see all of this around promoting this agonistic spirit which can be kind of quite challenging. I have this sort of idea that Nietzsche, one of the things that he wants us to do is to live experimental lives, which means that morally, I don't think Nietzsche has a morality. I think what he has is an immorality, the immoralist thing, which is to say, sure, you need to set up some parameters for yourself about what you think's right and what's wrong, what the best way for you to live is. But every now and again, just give yourself a terrible conscience. Do something that you think is really bad. Break your own rules, because you will only discover whether that rule is worth keeping or not once you've broken it. And so then you end up in this really agonistic contest with yourself and with other people in sort of a journey of discovery of what the next excellence is, but you're never there. So you've got to find another good contestant to get to ratchet, of argon.
This is a nice segue into your premise of your book, Neil, and your sort of aims of the book and what you're unpacking. And I think this is you kind of really nicely build this in the book up to like this friendship as a contest. You kind of want to get to the next page to kind of, you build up this nice background and story, and you reach this kind of peak in the book. And I spoke to Kieran about this, and we actually spoke to another philosopher during the week, and I was talking about this. So Kieran comes from a combat sports background, striking. I come from a grappling background, jiu-jitsu. We both played rugby as well. I'm ex-military. We've been in sort of conflict a lot. And it's really interesting because when I read this, I really thought about both Kieran and I both like to do physical and I'd say mental challenges as well. So we're quite happy to put ourselves in those positions. But a lot of people aren't. And I started thinking about other things as well, like debates. Tibetan Buddhist monks will debate each other as well. And it's not about putting people down. And it reminded me of some of the research that Jordan Peterson spoke about, like with rats wrestling. It's not about just kind of pushing people down the whole time. It's about playing a game where you're both helping each other kind of get to the next level, like you said. And I see this a lot in grappling. I say it to some of the guys that are more experienced or bigger. If you keep pushing that person into the mat and tapping them over and over again, they're not going to want to roll with you or play with you. So every now and then, give them a position, do something, coach them along, help them. And also then for the people at the lower level, you need to be stepping up, because exactly right. You keep challenging, everything raises up as well. And it's the same with education or academia and so on. And this seems to be the kind of central premise of the friendship as a contest, where you don't blow smoke up each other's arses, basically. You actually challenge each other. That's real love to grow. Would that be right?
Yeah, 100%. And I think I've been doing a bit of thinking since since the book around this idea of contest or argon and how to distinguish it from other things. So in particular around conflict and competition. So I've been trying to think, what is the difference between contest, as I describe it in the book, as you've summarized, Ian, and competition in a sort of, say, for example, in a sporting arena, but also just competitiveness between people and conflict. And I've sort of come up with a bit of a framework to think about that. But I think in contest, it only really works if someone is like your rough equal. Because if someone, like I used to be a sort of state level squash player when I was younger. And, you know, when friends find out you play squash, they say, let's have a game. You say, okay. And squash is a hard game, right? Like you have to have a certain level of competence to even begin to enjoy it. And so, you know, every now and again, I'd play with a friend, and it's just unenjoyable for both of us because it's hard for them to hit the ball, right? And so you don't want to be, you have to select an opponent who's a rough equal.
Yeah.
The other thing about contest is that you kind of also have somewhere the common interest in mind, or your opponent's interest in mind, which is to say you want to defeat them, but you want that defeat to spur them on, to make them better. And so you don't have, in pure conflict, you don't have that. You don't have the other person's interest in heart. You just kind of want to win, and you want to win as decisively and comprehensively and destructively as possible. And in competition, and also in conflict, you don't want, you want the weakest possible opponent. You just want to get in there, clean the slate. In conflict. In competition, you probably want a rough equal, but preferably just a little bit less than you, so you're more guaranteed of victory. But you don't have their interests at heart either. You just kind of want the win for the win's sake. You move on. But contest is kind of a higher order thing that adds to either conflict or competition. It adds to it this idea of, let's establish what excellence really looks like in this arena. There's this great example in the Homeric literature of a running race where the two front runners are going ahead of everybody else, and the winner gets over the line and he's being awarded his wreath, and he says, no, actually, I'm going to give this to second place. And everyone's like, why? He's like, well, they just had great form. Like, if you watch them run, you really got a sense of what it is to be a great runner. I just kind of got a bit lucky and blah, blah, blah. So the wreath goes to second place because they demonstrated the excellence of running better than the person that got over the line first. This is kind of quite counterintuitive for us, but I think this idea of contest is, what does it take to bring out the best in another person? What does it really take to bring out their best? And to answer that question, you have to know them intimately. You have to actually know what they are as a human being. And then you have to know what you can bring to the table that's going to push them. And it might be love and compassion, but it might be opposition, it might be enmity, it might be a whole range of dark emotional content that you need to bring to the table to push that person to the next stage. But that is really having their interest at heart. So that's the heart of friendship as contest.
Yeah. I think Kieran had attested to this as well. I think, like, I've been doing Brazilian jiu-jitsu for like nearly 12 years. And so, you know, there's guys in there. People would look at that externally and go, oh my God, how can you go in and just like fight with people every week? And I'm like, well, it's not fighting for us. It's beyond fighting. There's no ego involved in it. We're not in there looking for a fight. It's just like if you were sparring boxing as well. You're in there to play with each other and to push each other. Oh yeah, boy, like, you're supposed to be friends and you're laughing and joking, but then you like go really hard. I'm like, yeah, that's why we can, because I look at some of the guys that are the same level as me, same kind of height, weight, age, all that sort of stuff. And exactly to your point, they're the most fun, because if you're kind of equal, you're both pushing each other to find those incremental little improvements. But if I go with a guy that's 100 kilos, you know, he's been training 10 years longer than me, he's really strong, and he just keeps mashing me into the mat, I'm like, okay, that might serve his ego, but he's not learning anything, and I'm getting mashed into the mat. So there's nothing to be gained here except his ego of him going home and going, oh, I beat him. Yeah. Great. That's okay, but no one's learning anything. And you may have heard of Conor McGregor, the MMA guy. Yeah. His coach, John Kavanagh, from Dublin, has a great saying, and it's been around the martial arts area. It's either win or learn.
Yeah, right.
You know, and I think it's a great phrase, because in the losses, like you're saying, you can learn. So, but a question off the back of this is, Neil, in a world where people are offended by nothing, and we joked about it a few minutes ago, it seems really difficult that we can even enter into competition and contest when everything is conflict and it has to be instant win where you want someone's head chopped off. And we joked about it around about cancel. So how can we even bring this back into our world when people can't even get past the first part of allowing people to speak even?
Yeah, I really think this is one of the biggest problems we face at the moment in terms of social cohesion, is this idea that social cohesion means agreement. It means monolithic kind of views on everyone has to think the way I think about things. And the algorithms don't help. I mean, it pushes people at you that think like you do, and you get in this echo chamber of confirmation bias where it's just, everyone has to be like me, think like me, and if not, then I might fall apart, and you sort of people project,
or your safety might be at risk, so you might be harmed.
Yeah, and it's everyone's responsibility to make me safe. Now, I think there is some truth to that. So, I'm sort of center left, right? So I kind of think, well, a lot of harm has been done by an unequal distribution of power. So, like we were saying before, for the contest to work, you have to look for relatively equal power structures to make that work. So where those power structures haven't been in place, people have been harmed. So let's try to create a more level playing field so that the voices can actually be heard. If they're not heard, then you're not really going to get the contest. You're not going to get the difference. So there is a responsibility there, I think, for contestants to go in. It's a tough thing because you want to go in with your view, but you want to go in open-minded.
Yeah. You
want to say, look, even though I don't agree with you, or I find what you're saying confronting or offensive, or your lifestyle or whatever, I just want to, that's my position. So let's let you have your position, and let's create the space for that. You have your space. And so I think we do need to create, you guys might find this a bit of an awkward phrase, but I do like to think about having safe places to disagree.
I agree. I totally agree. I think that's what, just on that, that's what jiu-jitsu schools are. So we're not saying to walk down the road and pick a guy. Oh, look at him. He's 5'10", 80 kilos. I'm going to go up and just punch him in the face and this will be my contest. Yeah. No, do it. And that's what a martial arts academy is, or a boxing gym, or a rugby field. They are the safe spaces really to do that. Or the halls of academia where you can have these debates. The problem is in those safe spaces for some areas is you can't even have that. It's just an echo chamber, as you said. So I agree with you. It's a safe place and a safe environment and setting as well that's promoted, and you need good referees or good coaches to allow that to occur.
And what does safety mean? It means that you're not going to be needlessly annihilated by someone much stronger than you, or you're also not going to be kind of shut down and made irrelevant to the conversation. I think probably the worst from a Nietzschean perspective, the only kind of dark emotion that's Nietzsche can't contemplate that I find difficult with is indifference. I think indifference is a problem, but if you can respond to what people are saying to you, give them the space to say it, allow that person to be themselves and to have their view, and then to be able to say, well, that's not my view. My view is X or Y, and for that person to not feel threatened by someone else having a different view. That's the kind of cycle that we need to get into. I think you're right. We need adjudicators. My Instagram account's quite interesting. So I try to do philosophy on Instagram, and I have a newsletter on Substack. But the Instagram one I find quite interesting because the sort of people that follow me on Instagram are people who follow, kind of philosophy quotes, inspo quote type things, or wellness people, and that kind of thing. And some of the things that I say are kind of opposite to that. I talk about disgust and contempt as these sort of emotions that we experience, and they're okay to experience. And I don't try to remove that sort of dark side of life. And I have people engaging with me on the account in the comments where this is not their world. They come from a different place and they think that I'm wrong. They think that I'm putting out things that are unhelpful. And my response to that is often, I'm really glad to have this comment. I'm really glad to have someone who's prepared to disagree with me. And I'm not, no one on my, if someone posted disrespectful reply to someone on my account, I give them, it's a one strike thing. I try to reply and say, okay, you don't agree, that's fine. But we respect each other here. If you're not going to engage respectfully, you're out. And so second strike, I delete the comments. Because for me, it's really about trying to create that space where it doesn't matter where you are on the spectrum or what your view is. If you have a view that you want to put out there, well, let's make it safe for you to do that. But I don't have to agree with you. And we just need to make that okay.
Yeah. Are you familiar, Ian or Neil? Are you familiar? Sorry, Karen, one sec. I want to ask this question while it's in my head. Neil, are you familiar with Ian McGilchrist?
No.
So he's got two little small paperback books, which are like 1,000 pages each. No, I think they're there behind Kieran. And I've got a copy here as well. They're absolutely massive, two big books.
They're fucking like
The Matter with Things. Ian was he was, I think, originally at Oxford doing like classics. Then when he became a doctor, neurosurgeon or neuropsychiatrist, sorry. And then now,
but the reason he did is interesting. The reason he became, I just to give context, it adds to the context. The reason he became a doctor and just left his work in the English department and poetry and is because he found and I think Nietzsche would have loved it. He massively influenced by Nietzsche. He loves Nietzsche. He loves Heraclitus. Yeah. He like pre-Socratic philosophy that was more holistic, more embodied, you know, and but he left it because he didn't like the reductionistic, atomistic, critical, dissection-based approach, the kind of like kill it to dissect it kind of approach to poetry and literature that was characterizing the English departments. Because he was like, this is missing the whole fucking point. Like this fella spent who knows how much time writing a poem or a great piece of literature, and now you're going to try and pull it apart bit by bit, and you're fragmentary, dissecting kind of a way. So
left
it's like
brain, left brain, analytical,
left. So so that's the context of why he left to then go to medical school and do a whole different career in psychiatry was, I think, really important to what he ended up going on to do, to become this polymath, neuroscientist, psychiatrist, author, basically. So sorry, Ian. There.
Yeah, no, and that's good context anyway. But I'll send you I'll send you one talk after this, Neil, which is called "The Coincidence of Opposites," what he did at Ralston College with Stephen Blackburn. Yeah. I think that's his best
3 or 4 times.
Same here. And I think, Neil, when I read your book, I actually thought about Ian McGilchrist a lot, because he actually talks about the coincidence of opposites, you know, like he talks about this, and it's very much grounded in Heraclitus as well, which that's a little statue there of Heraclitus from Greece over there. A friend got me, he talks
War is the father and king of all things.
Yeah. But it's great, Neil, because it kind of aligns with what you're saying about this contest thing as well. And it's like a tree. A tree doesn't get strong by, sitting there with perfect sunshine every day. It needs wind and rain. It needs adversity. It needs this to flourish. I grew a little umbrella tree in my apartment that started off about that high. And then I moved here to a house just before coronavirus, and the tree got up to about maybe 5.5, 6 feet, big umbrella tree. And then one day I put it outside last year because it was raining a bit and it wasn't too bad, like the wind and stuff. And I thought I'll put it outside and give it a bit of a sprinkle. It'll get a nice shower. And then I came out and the tree was snapped in two.
Yeah.
And I thought, interesting, because it's been a house plant. It's never been exposed to wind. It's never been exposed to rain. It's never been exposed to adversity, and it broke in two. And I sat there having this philosophical moment about, this tree is weak as piss because I never allowed it to get strong. And I made it like a house cat, and I just kept it weak. And so I think some of your stuff is really to this point. And I think it's a perfect kind of linkage or correlation with Ian McGilchrist's work about, we need this adversity to flourish. We need to be pushed. We don't get weak by hiding away.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this idea of agonistic equilibrium. So a lot of people talk about equanimity, and we want to get to this balance, and we want to get to this place of peace and inner tranquility and all that sort of stuff. And I kind of think, well, actually, I think what's far more realistic is that we end up in an agonistic equilibrium, which is, it's a state of tension. Things pulling in different directions, and out of that, you can end up in a place of homeostasis where things are settled, but they're not depleted or deflated. And I think it's out of that tension of that equilibrium where creative things arise, or new thoughts arise, or new ways of living arise. And I think we want that state of tension and friction to create new things for us, and sort of this idea of balance or equanimity or inner peace. I mean, for me, it's like a form of death,
I agree. Yeah.
Not going anywhere, not being. So, and that's why I like Heraclitus too, because it's becoming, not being. It's endless. The developmental cycle that we're on, and when that ends, when we stop growing and stop developing and stop changing, I kind of think, well, why keep living?
Why bother? Yeah. I totally agree. And that's why I often say, to people, I'll never retire. Okay, I might be financially free independent at a certain time, but I'll always be doing something. I'll always have goals and objectives. I'm not going to sit there and just watch cowboy movies and drink tea on the couch. That to me is that's death. I might as well die. I'll be having the Albert Camus conversation with myself then. What is the point? Yeah. It's
but on that, even a cup of tea, if you look at the best cup of tea someone might ever have, if I think of my perspective, one of the best cup of coffees I ever had was a shit fucking, it was either Nescafe or Maxwell House fucking instant coffee, few spoons into a cup, watery, but it was because I had the shit kicked out of me by a mountain, and wind and fucking hail and rain smashed me up for hours, and I had to turn back, and I was baked and tired and cold, and then this one, any other circumstance would have been a shit cup of coffee, was unbelievable, warm, revivifying, because it's you're living in balance, not by living in balance. You're finding balance, not by living in balance, but by operating at the edges, and then the balance is found in the middle.
I always say to people, balance is a funny concept, because people think about balance as heading towards the middle, but that's at the most unbalanced point. In fact, if you run to the opposite ends, that's where you find balance, right? It's kind of, by having those opposites in your life, it's actually a more balanced state than trying to get to some sort of centered state. Anyway, that's a random thought.
What could people do, Neil, do you think, in their life to create this tension, adversity to flourish? What could people do, if anybody's listening to this? What would the normal George Jane be able to do to kind of create this in their life? What do you think?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I'm working on my second book at the moment, which I'm hoping will be a more general audience book, not an academic book. And what I'm writing about is what I'm calling Nietzsche's unspiritual exercises. So the idea of spiritual exercises, is this idea that there's certain practices you can put in your life that'll make you a better human being. But Nietzsche, I think, is a materialist. I'm a materialist. I don't think there's anything. I am my body. That's it. And so I'm calling them unspiritual exercises, but it's essentially trying to address that question, Ian, what are the practical what's a Nietzschean lifestyle look like? And I've got 8 things, and I have to remember them in sequence now, but it's walking. So Nietzsche it's all metaphors that Nietzsche uses. Walking, so that's looking after the basics, getting your life right, exercise, diet. But I take a sort of slightly different approach to that, which is I'm not aiming for some state of physical perfection. It really depends what you want to achieve in your life. So if you're a creator, an artist, and you don't really care how long you live, you just want to create the greatest piece of sculpture or art or whatever, well, knock yourself out, take LSD, take heroin, don't eat well, whatever it is, whatever you need to do to get your life task done, treat your body that way. That's my sort of take on that.
So you're recommending heroin. Okay, thanks, Neil.
No,
cheers.
Well, for certain people. The psychedelic assisted therapy thing is quite interesting, but that's a whole other conversation.
Oh, we've had people on about that before,
Then gardening is the next one. So gardening is about your inner world, right? So, I mean, I don't take the Stoic view that you can work directly on yourself. I think neuroscience kind of backs this up. How you feel, your inner drives, your inner composition, all of these things are the product of an environment. You can't decide, let's take this idea that your inner world is a garden and your garden is full of tomato plants. You can't decide, actually, I'd rather have eggplants. It's just kind of what you're given. It's what you're born with. All you can really do is create the environment that's best for tomato plants.
Yeah.
So you've got to think about your habits. You've got to think about your life. You've got to think about the people who are in your life. It's to say, I want to create an environment that's going to allow my drives to flourish the way I want them to flourish. And there are drives that I have that I actually don't want to flourish. So I need to create an environment that'll stifle those ones. So that's the gardening metaphor. Then there's the climbing. You like this one, Kieran. So climbing, and that's about getting out of your own head, right? So Nietzsche has this idea of climbing higher and higher mountains. Then when you get to the top of the mountain, just go out of your own head, because what you're trying to do is get a distant, cold perspective on what's going on in your life. So I'm just trying to say really objectively as we can, what is going on in my life, away from the influence of other people, away from the influence of society, just what do I really think or feel about X or Y, to get that pure crystal clarity about your own life. So I think solitude is a good thing in this perspective, or cutting yourself off from the internet, or whatever it is that's influencing you. Just go cold turkey for a little while. Could be an hour, could be a week, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Just come back to yourself and really get your own perspective on things is the climbing metaphor. Then the next one is sailing. So I don't know if you want this long answer, Ian, but anyway, I'll just keep
This is great.
Oh,
I'll
this
keep
is
going.
good.
This is great. This is great.
It's brilliant.
Yeah. So the next one is sailing. And so this was Nietzsche's metaphors around the Columbus discovery of new worlds, right? So sailing is about his experimentalism. It's kind of, so you're living your life a certain way, fine, you dress a certain way, you eat certain things, you hang out with certain people, you like certain music, whatever it is, you have certain, I'm a long distance runner. I do certain things, and I think Nietzsche would say, just try something else for a while. He was like, one of his great aphorisms is, one of the best, if you're a Christian, a committed Christian, one thing you really should do, just for your own benefit, is just live for a month as if you're not a Christian and just see how that feels.
The Amish systemized that.
What's that?
That's how they're still the Amish systemized that for a year.
Yeah,
they send out the Amish. Yes, they do that. They have that built in. After a certain age, the kids go off for a year and they come back if they want.
Yeah,
But they're told to go out and don't be Amish for a while.
There's a name on that. There's a name, and I can't remember what it's called.
Yeah.
But interesting, Neil, before you continue, just on that as well, you said about long distance running, because I did the very same thing. I ran long distance for like 10 or 12 years.
Oh, yeah.
And ran like Leadville 100 miler, the UTA there in Sydney, numerous years. And then went, right, I've had enough of this, and then switched and did long distance swimming because I couldn't do it. Yeah. So really pushed myself in the opposite way because I couldn't do it. Yeah. And you gain so much out of that. You really like learn a lot out of doing that, completely switching direction. It's fascinating.
Yeah, well, I'm thinking of running. I want to run the Sydney Marathon this year. It's my second marathon. But then I'm gonna try boxing, actually, because I've sort of said, well, I just need something completely
opposite.
Different,
yeah. You know? Perfect.
So, who knows? It might be terrible. My body might not be up for it. I might be psychologically unequipped to be punched in the head, but I want to find out, right?
Yeah.
So let's give it a go.
That was my sport for years. That was my main combat sport for years.
Right.
Yeah. There's actually a guy, speaking of this, I recommend, I was actually going to ask you about this guy.
Oh, hold on, Kerry. Can we finish off can we finish off?
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
We've got walking, garden, and climbing, sailing, because I'm frothing here to find out the next four.
Yeah. So actually, this one should have come before sailing, but it's flying. So Nietzsche has this idea of seabirds out on the ocean, the terrible horizonless ocean. We're completely unanchored. How do we live? And he has this idea of seabirds communing together on little islands for a little while. They sort of look around each other, spur each other on, they fly off, and this idea of pick your community. So you've got to be very selective about your intimate life, I think, if you want to flourish.
Yeah.
And there are points where you're going to you have to sit down and say, well, is this flock that I'm flying with the right flock for me for this next stage? And there's a certain ruthlessness in that, I think. But I think and we need a certain emotional toughness to be able to say, well, I really do like these people, love these people, but for the next stage of my life, I'm not sure they're the right ones. And you don't need to be mean to people or horrible, but I just think we need to be a little bit ruthless, because the people in our lives are a fundamental part of the environment in which we flourish or don't flourish. And I think, there's a certain element of that. So flying is another one. Then we've got dancing, laughing, and playing. So dancing is this idea of dancing in chains. So yes, you're free. Yes, you can choose to do whatever you want to do. But wherever you go, you're always going to have some constraint. So what you have to do is figure out how to optimize your life within those constraints. Relationships is a good one. You might decide, well, I'm not going to stick with this group of friends. I'm going to stick with this group of friends because that's what I think is going to get me to this next stage of my life. But as soon as you're involved with other people, they're going to make demands of you. You're going to have to compromise your training because your partner wants to go out to dinner. You're going to have whatever it is, right? So what you have to do is figure out within those constraints, within those chains, how to dance, how to make an art form of it, how to absolutely embrace the form, the structure, in order to express yourself and your creativity. So that's the dancing part. Laughing, now this is getting a bit existential, but then these are all sort of build on one another. I think laughing is this idea of just kind of really, we get very involved in these things and we think it's really important and we're looking for purpose and meaning and we're trying to build a life that is satisfying and all those sorts of things. And ultimately, what we're operating out of is the frustration that none of that is here right now. And so we're always working towards it. We're always driving towards it. And the whole thing is totally absurd. I mean, 100 years from now, 50 years from now, 250 years from now, none of this is going to matter to anyone. It's all going to have completely, and yet we take it all so seriously.
I know, yeah.
We need to tweak this. And what if that happens? And blah, blah, blah. And there's this laughing aspect, which is just to say,
just to keep this in my desk.
Yeah,
Fat laughing Buddha.
Yeah.
That exact same reason.
Yeah. It's just, like sort of don't take it all so seriously, I guess, is the laughing side of it. There we go.
That's my one to remind me.
Sort of memento mori kind of thing.
Yeah, that's the one I have here in the office the whole time. My wife thinks it's a bit dark. I love it. Yeah. And the last one, just to finish off, the last one is playing. So I think you can put all of this together and just treat life as a game. And, you win some, you lose some, you get hurt, you find love, you experience contempt, you succeed in something you tried to succeed in, you fail miserably. It's a game. And what you have to do through all of these things is just play the game to the best that you can. So this will be the backbone of the new book, Neil.
Yeah, so those are my 8 chapters, those 8 unspiritual exercises. So
great. You're following the steps of all the cult leaders like Jordan Peterson. They come up with like 8 rules, 10, 12. Yeah. Brilliant. We should start a book, 3 rules why not to listen to people. That's brilliant. Neil. Really looking forward to that. That's awesome. So Kieran, sorry, you had a question there in the middle.
Yeah, so, no, just on, this is something that this might be a kind of a non-question, I suppose, because you might have never heard of him or read about it. But speaking of boxing and just Nietzsche, I came across this lad recently, Mishima, a Japanese writer, Mishima, Yukio Mishima, and his book Sun and Steel. So he's one of the closest things. There's a couple of people few people have come across in the 20th century that are like as close to like an real life Nietzscheans as I can actually imagine, and this is one of them. Who have you ever heard of him? First of all, I haven't. He was an author.
He's very good. Yeah.
Long story short, there's so much going on. So long story short, he's a kind of he's an very successful author, like multiple time, I think Pulitzer Prize or really successful, and maybe even not even Pulitzer, like maybe like Nobel Prize in literature or something like the big ones, and nominated but he was also very Nietzschean. Then he realized at a certain point that he was extremely lacking on the physical side. That he was like I think he was in his early 30s or late 20s, realized he was extremely lacking on the physical side, and then got into bodybuilding and boxing and kendo sword fencing, and carried them, like went at it, like physically developed his body at a time when very few people were doing that, especially in Japan. But he was like a kind of a mystic nihilist, and that he was basically a kind of a fascist. He became like a kind of a fascist as well. He was anchored to kind of nothing. And he took this Nietzschean notion of life is as an aesthetic act all the way to the end, to the point where he genuinely took it and he carried it to 11, like all the way to the extent where he had his own militia that was actually at one point funded and trained by the Japanese government. But then he tried to actually launch a coup and take over the Japanese government tried to take over a Japanese military base to launch a coup. And then when the coup didn't work, he'd orchestrated that he commit seppuku in the office of the general of this military base in his 40s. And he just cut his guts out, and then his gay lover cut his head off. And he didn't even, and he just left a letter on his desk at home. And his wife had brought the kids to school that day. So his wife brought the kids to school, and he took off and, cut his own guts out and got his head decapitated trying to launch a coup taking over Japan. So that he genuinely took the whole notion of life as an aesthetic act to maximum all the way, in a way that I was like, I can't even believe this is a real person. Like, this guy fucking, how the fuck if I got my whole, like, my decade now into philosophy, and I'm only coming across this fella a few months ago. But he actually wrote really beautifully in this tiny little book. It's only less than 100 pages, really beautifully about the act of combat and the act of boxing, as well as running and lifting weights. He takes like lifting, running, and boxing, and sword fencing in there as well. The sword fencing and the boxing, he writes about them very similarly, about it's almost kind of mystical moments, the way he's articulated these moments of conflict with another person as this real primordial contact with reality, that it's so real. It's just you and this other person. It just resonated so much with me from years of boxing and martial arts and stuff. So I'd recommend this little book, Sun and Steel.
I'll have a look at it. Yeah, that's
very interesting character.
Amazing.
But yeah, your book there is I'm really looking forward to obviously reading the first book, which I haven't had a chance yet, but I will be reading it, because to hear how these Nietzschean concepts can be grappled with, especially for an everyday life, to actually apply these in our lives. I'm really interested to hear, so you talk so much about it.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm sort of thinking through now. I mean, I think this book is sort of reasonably academic for an academic audience. But what I'm interested in is trying to describe a Nietzschean lifestyle. Sort of, I mean, Nietzsche would hate this because he wasn't really into the everyman kind of thing. But I kind of think, there are people out there, I think, who are casting around for alternatives to the sugar and spice and all things nice approach to.
Look how popular Stoicism got. That's what Stoicism was.
Exactly. And I think I have problems with the I mean, I think there's lots of value in Stoicism, but I have some problems with it as well, particularly for young men, where it seems to be most popular around how you treat your emotional life in that. So I think so to get back to your original question, what can people do? I mean, I think what we were talking about before, why is it so hard to have proper contests? Why is it so hard to find people that we can engage, disagree, we can experience, anger and frustration and contempt for their points of view, but we can still stay engaged and they can hate me for a while? And why can't we find people that are robust enough for us to have that sort of productive, intimate engagement with? And I think there's a whole host of reasons for that, but one is that people are very unused to it, and so very unprepared for it, very undeveloped in terms of being able to do that kind of thing. So I think one of the things is, let's think really explicitly and carefully about what it takes to develop into that kind of person who is strong enough to engage with people who disagree. What does it take to get from where we are now, which is kind of this fear of otherness, fear of difference, fear of alternatives, because of the threat that it poses to me, supposedly. How do we get from there to feeling strong enough and powerful enough to manage those threats and to engage with them and interact with them and grow from them? I think there are some things we can do as individuals, and I think there's a narrative around the sort of top line narrative, which is kind of like it's everybody else's responsibility or fault that I'm in this situation where I can't deal with the world around me, and so therefore everyone else, the world around me, has to change and adapt so that I can find a place. Whereas I think actually the other narrative is actually you can change and adapt. You can become more sort of fit for purpose for a world in which contest is inevitable. And you start with yourself, you start with your life, your lifestyle, how you're treating your body, how you're treating your mind, who you're in contact with, and so, but have a very deliberate pathway to growth to say, well, I'm going to put myself in contact with people who are different from me, but not so different that I can't actually do it. I'm going to start treating my body in a way that actually helps me experience distress, physical distress, but not too much, so that I can just take that next step in kind of mental robustness. And when all that sort of stuff is about putting yourself on a pathway, but don't go all the way, because you will just like if I tried to run a marathon 3 years ago, as I did, end up lots of Achilles injuries, and I just wasn't strong enough. That's taken years of development and going to the gym and having a program and to get to that point. I think people can actually set up a program for their lives where they go, I want to get on a pathway where I can engage with the world around me. I can get into contests and I can benefit from that.
Yeah, I think when you speak like that, Neil, you remind me of the Japanese philosophy called Kaizen, which is Kaizen refers to small incremental improvements, which is basically been popularized in management and business because it's been used in production, like from the total quality management stuff by William Deming and the sort of post World War II explosion in Japanese manufacturing that we've seen. And they've kind of taken the best of the West and their own philosophy and merged them together. But Kaizen is this small incremental improvement, or like in sports science, which Kieran would be more familiar with, is this train and load progression as well. Like exactly what you said. You can't just go out and go, right, you know, it's Monday, I want to have a boxing match on Saturday, or I want to run a marathon on Sunday. You need to incrementally improve your skills, your cardio, all of those type of things. And I think it's the same as well with it comes back to the contest that we spoke about before. You can't walk into a gym as a white belt in jiu-jitsu and go, I want to spar a black belt, because you're going to get your arse handed to you. But you have to make a pathway to get to that level where you can have that contest with that person if that's what you want to do. But I think also there's benefit when I read your book about pushing yourself in multiple different directions, not just a physical. You're talking about going hard to the left or hard to the right in terms of the one way to the other. Like I love in a day, some of my most fruitful days are like I will go maybe swim. I might go swimming in the morning. I might go grappling in the afternoon. So up ends of the spectrum. And in between, I might pick up like a philosophy book or the Iliad or something, or work on a business proposal as well. And I'm pushing myself in 4 or 5 different directions. And they're the most fruitful days for me. It's not about the volume. It's about the directions I push myself, because I'm really kind of developing in different ways. They're the days where I sit back in the day and go, oh, that was awesome.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. And I think if we have to read things that we don't agree with, I think I've had this sort of dream of a search engine that I call Gaggle, which, you know, because like Google search results, it finds what's closest to your profile and sends you those results.
Yeah.
That means it also knows the results that aren't anywhere near your profile. So I want to get like Gaggle to collect all of those discarded results and get that sent to me.
Yeah.
So I can find out, you know, the internet used to be a place where you could find things that are really outside of your own horizon, but now you just sent things that confirm your biases. So I think we need to be able to find online communities, and I'm really keen to work on this in a practical way, where we have real difference. You know, it's not the Twitter sphere of just like throwing 240 characters of sort of hate at somebody, but it's like, okay, how do we engage with people that are really, really different to us? I mean, the post of mine on Instagram that got the most hate was I posted about World Pride, and you know, I got an MMA fighter telling me that, you know, being sympathetic towards the LGBTQI community was a sort of horrendous thing, and the Spartans would have, you know, killed those people, and I should follow ancient Greece in that way. I was like, well, this is really interesting that this is the post where I get all the hate, and it's obvious. It's part of our world at the moment, this debate and discussion, but it's kind of such a polarizing topic, and I want to be able to find or create a space where it doesn't matter where you sit on any topic, and it doesn't matter how problematic that is for the other people in the room, that we can just have the space, have a platform to put our views forward, our life experiences forward, and we can hear the opposite and say, okay, it's all right. You have this reaction to me, to my position, to my view. I find that interesting. Tell me more about that. And, you know, that is the kind of space I think we need to get into, but it doesn't exist, it seems, at the moment.
But part of why it doesn't, and I couldn't agree with you more, like, because without that ability to foster, like, the only real diversity that matters, I think, is a diversity of opinion. Like the the identity-based stuff horrifies me that's going on, because there's an infinite number of ways you can divide people up by identity. It dehumanizes people. It draws ridiculous stereotypes and applies them. It assumes people have certain ideas based on the color of their skin or based on their sexual orientation or something. It's so degrading and infantilizing, and in a Nietzsche, in a very Nietzschean, to use Nietzschean phrase, it's so much of it is aspirational victimhood and weaponized compassion and weaponized aspirational victimhood, like trying to climb, trying to accumulate status and prestige by demonstrating how much of a victim I am. It's like, it's so horrid. It's like in every direction. It's so, like, when you see and it's contributing to all sorts of mental health issues as well, because it's training people, young people, it's training them to be helpless. It's training them to be impacted by the world rather than being able to have an impact on it. It's so, it's the opposite of what you want in a sturdy society. And like, I have a quote here that summarizes it from a piece of writing that I dug up, because it kind of captures this kind of what this kind of thing results in. And it's from this video that was doing the rounds. I took the quote down with this lady, Ashley Shackelford, who identifies herself as a queer, non-binary, black fat femme writer, cultural producer, and artist. And it's like a 1-minute video that you watch and you're like, this must be a joke. Like, this couldn't be real. And she said, quote, she's talking to a room full of white people, basically, in this big presentation, standing in front of this white flipboard. And she says, quote, you're always going to be racist, actually. So even when you're on your path to trying to figure out how to be a better human being, because I believe that white people are born into not being human, that y'all are born into a life to not be human. And that's what y'all are taught to do, to be demons. So in this particular way, white people are all racist. So I just want y'all to know that up front. And that's how she starts her presentation, standing in front of a flip chart that says, PayPal me. So it's like, we'll put the link to it in the show notes. But like, I just find, like, and when you see so much of the intolerance around diversity of ideas, even especially so when it's got to do with the kind of near enemy, like when you look at the culture war stuff, when you have gay writers who think that so much of the trans stuff has gone off the rails because it's taking all these different trans issues and just lumping it in as trans community, as if it's one blanket thing, as if young, vulnerable, traumatized, often autistic teenage girls are in the same category as autogynephilic males, are in the same category as people who have had gender dysphoria since they're a toddler, and it's just lumping them all in as the one category. And then it's resulting in all these horrendous situations that, because it's lumped in as one category, there's a fear on the progressive side that if we acknowledge any of the bad stuff, we're giving ammunition to the enemies of the LGBTQ idea and group, or whatever you want to call it, or non-heteronormative group. But then by doing that, it actually gives more ammunition, because then the people who are against anything that resembles non-heteronormativity then go, well, look, they don't care that there's rapists going to women's prison, or that women's sport is getting wrecked, or that, etc. They don't. So then it just like be like a volley of intolerance. It is going back and forth because of an unwillingness to acknowledge truth and an unwillingness to acknowledge reality as it actually is, even when it's uncomfortable. And when you have an ideology with this identity-based stuff, this kind of progressive identity-based stuff, that fosters an unwillingness to engage in debate and categorizes notions of like things like reason and a respect for evidence and empiricism and data, and thinks that maths is racist accept and just thinks that reason is a tool of the white supremacy of like white European cis heteronormative patriarchal tyranny or whatever, then you end up in a situation where they're trying to even foster discourse and foster a situation where we can see each other on a level of common humanity and exchange information. And by the end of a conversation, even like agree to disagree and not reach a conclusion and be comfortable with ambiguity and comfortable with gray zones and comfortable with the moral difficulties that show up, and that so much of our understandings of the world we can't rationally, propositionally present yet. We might be able to, but we don't quite know why we're uncomfortable with something, and that it's okay for it to be a gray zone, and that it's okay for us to not have this monocultural view. If you have an ideology that straight on thinks that certain ways of thinking even or speaking are harmful and dangerous and words are violence, then you're immediately even removing the possibility for, you're like, it's a different game that's being played. It's just power. It's just power with no attempt to even foster or even attempt to even become aware of the fact that they might be wrong, or that there's it's almost like it's essentially like, so much of it is, it's a really, really, really dogmatic, intolerant, quasi-religious way of viewing reality, because it's totally exclusionary of anything that doesn't agree with it. And in that, it becomes very concerning, because you end up with people that get sacrificed at the altar of whatever DEI thing, that the landmine they stepped on, and then they lose their job, or they have to publicly apologize, or they lose their career, or you just end up with fostering actual racism, or you end up generating racism, generating homophobia, generating whatever phobia you put in there, because people who otherwise would voice their views in public, but now they're afraid to, but they might have a ridiculous view, but because they don't voice it, their bubble never gets burst, and then it festers underneath the surface. And then it blows up somewhere else in an election box, and all of a sudden there's some lunatics getting voted into office or something. You know, it's like it's like how to foster open discourse and a free exchange of information when there's an intolerance towards that idea at all. You know, that's the challenge.
No, I think that's really insightful, Kieran. I mean, I also think part of this is not. Well, I've got two responses to that. One is, I mean, my own view is that anything based on in-group, out-group thinking is kind of a bit limiting. I mean, I would actually say stupid. I mean, I think Nietzsche's individualism is really helpful here, that, to think something about someone because in your mind they belong to a category or a group just ignores all of the reality of being an individual. That no one individual ever neatly, exactly, precisely fits the stereotype. The stereotype is an abstraction based on thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of experiences, to the point where they, what I think we have to come to terms with is the individual. Forget about what category they belong to and deal with that individual human being on their own terms as a fact, as a empirical reality that you have to deal with. So I think that's one thing I would say to that. And I think a lot of damage is done by this sort of in-group, out-group mentality that's, as you say, you can cut and divide it anyway. And the way people cut and divide it is usually what suits their own sort of power play. That's one thing. The other thing I would say to that, you made a case there for rationality and reasonability. And I think those points are very well made. I think I would add to that that's the moralizing about emotional responses is a big problem too, because then people become unable to admit that they experience contempt or disgust or hatred or whatever the dark, supposedly immoral, it's immoral to feel that. And so then people will not be able to admit that they feel those things. And then those things start driving their thinking. And there's a lot of neuroscience actually says, we're feeling creatures first and thinking creatures second. And so I think unless we get to the feeling, the moral, stop moralizing about emotions, so-called dark or negative emotions, and say, look, this is just a feeling that it's human. We react a certain way to certain people and experiences. It doesn't mean that we have to be violent. It doesn't mean that we have to exclude them. It doesn't mean anything. It's just a sort of psychobiological kind of response to a situation. We feel fear, we feel anger, we feel threat, all these things, until we can say, actually, you know what, that is what I feel. I'm not proud of it. I'm not ashamed of it. It just is a fact. But I don't want that to drive how I think and how I relate to you as a human being. But I just need to admit, or not admit, that sort of implies it's negative. I just need to be transparent about my emotional life, which is actually the driver of a lot of these things. I don't think we'll get anywhere, but it's like it's immoral to feel disgust. Well, no, it's not. It's just human to feel disgust. The question is, what does that reveal to you? What are you going to do with that? What does that tell you about yourself? What does that tell you about the circumstances that you want to be in? So I think there's a whole world there that I'm doing a lot of thinking and reading about at the moment around how we moralize about our emotional lives and trying to get away from that as well.
Yeah,
excellent. Listen, thanks very much, Neil. We've gone there for an hour and a half, and I know we've run out of time. So I really want to thank you for coming on today. That was a great conversation. It's a great privilege actually to pick an author's brain about the book and how I interpreted the book as well. So it's great. So for anybody, it's Nietzsche's Renewal of Ancient Ethics. It is well worth the money. If you have found this conversation interesting, go and buy it, because it is an excellent book. And I think it's one of those books that I think will keep on giving. I'm interested to read this book again in 6 months or a year, because on our conversation about changing our minds or challenging ourselves in different ways, I think that's one of these books that you'll read in a year and you might even either maybe disagree with it or agree with it more. So the squeeze will be worth the juice. Neil, for anybody that wants to get in contact with you, follow you, find out more about your work, do you offer any online courses? Do you do any teaching? Do you do any lecturing? You got Substack, you said, you spoke about Instagram. What's all the ways people can maybe learn more about your stuff?
No, thanks, Ian. And also thank you to both of you for the conversation today. I found it extremely stimulating and very happy to continue to engage if the opportunity comes up. In terms of what I'm doing at the moment is so Instagram is a big thing for me, trying to do some philosophy on Instagram.
Yeah.
So that's just my handle is my name, Neil Durrant. And I've started the Substack newsletter, which really at the moment is just my Instagram content, but delivered to your mailing, to your email address. But what I am doing is working at the moment on some ways of packaging up this sort of Nietzsche lifestyle stuff in a way that people can access. So I guess I'd say watch this space, subscribe to my Substack, and then we'll have some new things that we're launching the second half of this year that people can sort of learn more.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, we'd definitely be interested, man, talking to you more again. We'd love to have you on, explore more topics. There's 100 more topics I think that Karen and I would love to explore with Nietzsche, with you. Will to power.
Covered notes here. I got to ask you a few questions.
Will to power. Slave morality. There's lots of different things here, and we've only kind of scratched the surface of things we'd love to talk to you about. And I think if any philosopher was more relevant today, Nietzsche is the one that needs to be get a bit more airplay. So that's great.
Couldn't agree more.
Look, Neil, we'll let you go. Thank you very much. Really appreciate your time. And for everybody else, thanks for listening in, and we'll talk again.
Thanks very much.